You are watching Grassroots Community Television, helping you make television people watch everywhere. Broadcasting on cable channel 82 in Glenwood Springs and Carbondale, and channel 12 in Aspen, Snowmass, Basalt, and Elgin. Free over-the-air broadcasts throughout the Roaring Fork Valley. All programs can be watched anytime, anywhere at grassrootstv.org.
Welcome here again to the Rio Grande Room this Friday, February 24th, 2012, Aspen, Colorado, as Powder to the People presents its Backcountry discussion series in collaboration with Brian McCall and the Colorado Avalanche Center. My name is Mike Sladden, and your host and founder and director of Powder to the People. Our special guest tonight is Mike Marolt. For anybody who does not know who he is, he's a lifetime local, a noted mountaineer, and a skier with a lot of first descents on skis. Mike will talk about the brain and decision-making in survival situations, and he will be following Brian's update on the local snowpack, and will take your questions during and after his presentation. If you do have questions during the discussion, and we encourage it, for those watching from home on Grassroots TV and grassrootstv.org's video on demand streaming, please raise your hand and I'll come over to you with the mic so they can hear your questions, so the speaker doesn't have to repeat your question. And if you're looking for this or our other just discussions from the past, that can be found on the library there at grassrootstv.org. The keyword for the search is powder. And I'll just pass it over to Brian now, and welcome.
All right. Thank you, Mike. Been an interesting season since the last time we met. A couple of things I wanted to talk about tonight, just some current snowpack problems. There's a lot going on in that snowpack. Briefly going to touch on some avalanche accidents that we've had.
Okay. Just for the questions.
All right, we'll briefly touch on some avalanche accidents that we've had in the last month or so. A couple of tips for dealing with the weak layers that we got in the snowpack this year. And then I definitely wanted to leave some time in my talk tonight for questions. There's a lot of interesting things going on in our snowpack for this year. I had a hard time paring down this talk to about 30 minutes or so. I could have gone on for a couple of days with all the things that are going on in our snowpack. We're still below average for precipitation. Last I looked, about 75% or so of average for this year. We've got deep weak layers. We've got weak layers in the middle of the snowpack. And it's only February. We've had 6 avalanche deaths in the last month. There's been 20 in the west. So we still got a lot of winter left. And unfortunately, there's probably going to be a number of accidents that are still happening. I put together a really quick video of some recent observations, and I thought I would just start off with this. You'll start to see some trends in these videos. All right, certainly all those snowpack tests, one thing you'll notice how sudden those failures are, those fractures are in those tests. The columns just seem to jump off on steeper slopes like that, and that's something that we've seen all winter long since we started getting snow in about mid-January this year. And it was actually really hard to pare down all the videos for this presentation. There's all the cameras that are in the backcountry these days. There's countless videos of people doing anything. So that's all I've got. We're done. This winter, we've had 6 avalanche fatalities in Colorado, 20 in the United States. All those have been in the western U.S. Kind of interesting that we've had 3 avalanche fatalities within the ski area boundaries this winter, and one of them was actually on an open run. One of them was early season in Utah before the area was open, and another one was on a closed run in Vail this season, but pretty rare that we actually see avalanche deaths at ski areas, and been a pretty unique season. The other thing that we've seen is these accidents, both geographically and in time, happen in clusters. We just had 2 or 3 avalanche fatalities in the last couple of days. There was 2 yesterday, one in Utah and one in Montana. So if you look at the maps of the accidents, they happen close together, and they happen within a short time period as well. So we've had these clusters of avalanche accidents, and over the course of 4 or 5 days, we see a number of fatalities happening. 16 of the U.S. fatalities of the 20 that have occurred have been since the 18th of January. So really short time period. And the 6 in Colorado have happened within 29 days of each other. So if we look at an average winter for Colorado, we see 5 or 6 avalanche fatalities. Right now we're sitting right at that average of 6 deaths, but those 6 deaths have occurred in less than a 1-month period, which is really unique for our season. And the other thing, as I go through, I've got a number of photos from some of these avalanche sites, the accident sites. Notice that these accidents are happening in small terrain features, in big terrain features, on open slopes, on treed slopes, in gullies. There's no one defining characteristic for the terrain where these avalanches are happening this year. It's kind of been all over the map. And I pulled up just a handful of photos of some interesting incidents from this one, from this season. We started off in mid-December here. This was on Red Mountain Pass on the battleship. This was a partial burial with one person getting injured in this avalanche. And here's one to note as well. January 1st, pretty rough start to the new year on Berthoud Pass. This was a skier-triggered avalanche. As I mentioned, this is an example of some of the bigger terrain features where we're seeing avalanche accidents this year. The person was buried right down about in here in that debris, and it was triggered from somewhere in here, fairly high on the slope. The guy went for quite a long ride and got lucky to survive in that avalanche. Locally on Burt Mountain, January 18th, we had an avalanche fatality. Fairly unique case in that the size of the avalanche was so small with this fatality. I didn't show it in this particular photo, but this short path did run out into a bit of a terrain trap gully. It was fairly steep, about 45 to 50 degrees at the start zone, and all of that snow kind of funneled into a gully, a little creek bed at the bottom of this slope. The avalanche ran only about 30 vertical feet and 50 feet in length, and it was only, the one that he triggered was only about 14 feet wide, and it was enough to bury him at the bottom of this slope. The other incident that I have photos of from Winter Park this winter was also about 30 vertical feet. And looking back at avalanche accidents, there's only been a handful of people that have actually died in avalanches that were this small. So kind of a good indication of just how weak our snowpack is for this season. This one, January 21st. So as I mentioned, these accidents often happen within a 4 or 5 day period from each other. So we started on January 18th with the first one. A few days later, this was near Buffalo Pass, up near Steamboat in North Park. 2 people were caught. They were snowmobilers, but they had gotten their snowmobiles stuck and they were walking out when the avalanche occurred. So it actually got triggered on foot Two of them were caught and one was killed. And here's an example. We're getting into some of these heavily treed slopes and smaller terrain features. Not all of them have been like the Berthoud Pass avalanche there, where they were quite so large. The next day, Winter Park, January 22nd, this was inbounds, and it was on an open run. One gentleman was killed in this avalanche, and this is another example of one that only ran about 30 vertical feet or so, and it did kind of funnel down into another small gully terrain trap feature. Okay, and this one has been all over the internet. I think it's had close to 1 million people have watched it on YouTube. This was not an injury, but there's been a lot of debate about equipment that we carry in the backcountry this season, the airbags, the avalanche beacons, shovels, probes, etc. And this was one of the first incidents this season that happened with somebody using an airbag. If we can get this to run. All right, we may have to come back to that one. See if we can get it to run. In this case, it was a woman. She was a snowboarder. On January 25th, skied out into this slope in Montezuma, which is just up valley from Keystone, triggered quite a large avalanche, and deployed her airbag partway down the slope and was able to stay on the snow surface in this particular incident. It debated or brought on a lot of debates. The Friends of CAIC has a website. They posted this video, and within a couple hours, there was something like 100 different comments about this incident on there, and a lot of them involved decision making with this particular avalanche. Should they have been there on that given day? Pretty interesting case. I'll see if I can get it to work before the evening's over here. All right, and then there was a bit of a break from the accidents, a couple of weeks without too many incidents, and then we had another one on the 13th of February in the Bear Creek drainage just outside of Telluride. This particular accident also sparked a lot of debate. The gentleman was carrying an airbag. He was carrying an Avalanche. He was wearing an avalanche beacon and still got killed in this avalanche. The one thing that he was missing that didn't come up in a lot of the media reports was a partner. He was traveling by himself. It was a high hazard day, and there was an avalanche warning out for the northern San Juan zones at the time of this accident. There's one interesting thing that we've seen from accidents this year as well is that there have been, I think we've had 4 fatalities that have occurred on days with high danger and avalanche warnings out there. Most of our accidents tend to happen when it's moderate or considerable danger, but we see a lot more people this season for some reason traveling when there's been high danger. And another interesting thing I read with this Telluride incident is that the rescue team had a hard time getting to the site because there were somewhere upward, up to 200 people that were skiing in Bear Creek drainage on that particular day. So it really got me thinking, what are 200 people doing in this drainage on a high hazard day? There's some disconnect going on with this side country terrain and a day when there's high avalanche danger. And this is another look of that, look at that Telluride avalanche looking down the path. It was a really heavily treed slope that flowed into a narrow gully and ran probably a couple thousand feet down this hillside here. Not the kind of terrain I really want to go for a ride in. With that Montezuma incident, that woman was able to stay on the snow surface with her airbag. That was kind of the perfect slope to get caught on. It was a broad open slope above tree line. There were no terrain traps, no gullies or anything for her to get caught in. And the debris in that avalanche kind of spread out in 2 different directions. This is the kind of terrain that the airbag is not going to do a whole lot for you. And in this case, he did deploy his airbag, but that got punctured right away by all the trees that were in that path. So a number of the comments that we've seen this season, with that first incident in Montezuma, It's like, wow, the airbags are great. They saved a life. Here's the video. Here's the proof. 2 weeks later, we see this one here where the airbag really didn't help out a whole lot. So interesting season. A few days later, Wolf Creek Pass, we had another avalanche fatality on the 16th of February. Had a sparsely treed slope. There's definitely some steeper terrain here. And again, looking down this path here, would be a tough place to get caught. You'd probably get bounced around through some trees in there. So kind of a grim way to start my talk this week, but it's what's been going on in our backcountry in the last month or so. And this is another one. No injuries, no fatalities in this avalanche, but unfortunately there was a dog that was buried and killed in this avalanche. And I put this one in just because it was kind of an interesting case and another example of some large terrain. I think it was probably a considerable avalanche danger on this particular day. Swamp Canyon, this was near Ophir on the 15th of February. And this is a look from Google Earth of this terrain. The interesting thing with this one, you can see, let's see, the avalanche was triggered from right here, and the skier took a ride and was buried right down here, or partially buried right down here at the bottom of that slope. At the time that this avalanche was triggered, 2 or 3 other avalanches that were not quite connected to this one ran at the same time. So not only did they trigger this slope that they were skiing on, but they got some avalanches to run in completely separate start zones at the same time that avalanche was triggered. They were carried down that slope, partially buried, and unfortunately the dog did not survive on this one. And this is a couple of views of this Swamp Canyon area. Fairly deep avalanche at the crown. You can see failed close to the ground right here. And then looking the other way across this, there's a person standing right here for scale. So you can see another quite a big skier-triggered avalanche in this case. As I said, there were many, many other incidents I could have brought up this evening, unfortunately. And these were some of the interesting ones. What's going on in our snowpack? It's been a few years since we've had a good depth hoar problem in Colorado. And it's been quite a few years since we've had a depth hoar layer that's been this reactive for this amount of time. It started snowing. Many of you guys know we had a very dry early season. We had hardly any snow in November and most of December. We had some smaller storms around New Year's, and then about the middle of January, somewhere around the 13th, 14th of January for most of the state, we started seeing some bigger storms. Those storms fell on a snowpack that, because it was shallow, because it was weak already, created a real avalanche problem in the backcountry. That lower layer in the snowpack, a little bit hard to see, but in this particular pit starts about right here. In a lot of the snow pits I've dug throughout the course of the winter, that depth hoar layer in the lower snowpack makes up probably 50% of our snowpack. In some places it's buried a little deeper. But it's a real significant weak layer. The interesting thing about it this season is, with all that dry weather that we had in the fall, slopes that did have snow on them, so especially the northern half of the compass or so, the grain size for that depth hoar got up to 6, 7, 8 millimeters in some cases, and that's fairly rare, and that's part of the problem that we're dealing with this season. Those grain sizes are really big. There's a lot of pore space in between them, and they're just not going to bond. That problem's going to stick with us for quite a while. A couple other recent avalanches have run in the middle of the snowpack right here, and that layer is, in this pit it was a surface hoar layer. It's fairly obvious right in here. In a couple other areas, it's some small facets, or it might be a melt freeze crust sitting above facets on the sunny aspects in there. So there's that mid-pack weak layer that's been in some recent avalanches. Both natural and trigger people have triggered that weak layer first, and then maybe it steps down into the depth hoar. Or maybe that depth hoar layer in the lower part of the snowpack is what was triggered initially. But those are kind of our two significant problems right now. And that's a look at some of the surface ore layers that we've seen recently. And this is from this particular pit right here, which was up near the Eston Hut, south of Eagle. And those grain sizes were quite large in there. And then that's some of our depth ore grains that are sitting in the lower snowpack. In this particular case, this is just an individual grain. As I mentioned, the grain size on those, the scale in that photograph is about 3 millimeters. And that's typically what we see for depth ore grains, is 3 to 4 millimeters in size in an average winter in Colorado. This year it's not uncommon to see twice that size, and you'll also find them in chains often with 4 or 5 or 6 grains kind of bonded together in these giant chains of depth ore. Really interesting stuff. So super quick review on some of this. Within that snowpack, air temperatures, the height of the snowpack, and the ground temperatures are the things that drive change within those snow grains once they're sitting on the ground, once they've been sitting there for an extended period of time. During the winter, the temperature at the ground is typically right near freezing, so 32 Fahrenheit, 0 Celsius, somewhere in there. The snowpack is often much colder, and it's that difference in temperature that drives the changes in those snow grains. And a shallower snowpack with cold air temperatures, you've got a big change in temperature from 0 degrees at the ground, and maybe the air temperature is minus 20 or something like that. When you've got that shallow early season snowpack and those big changes in temperatures, we get those depth ore grains that grow quite quickly. So they might start off as something that looks like this. You've got some rounded grains. Over the course of a few hours, a couple of days, they start to develop straight edges, corners on the grains. And over the course of the month of November, like we had this year with no snow, any slope that actually did have snow on it, the grains turned into these large angular facets and depth ore grains. And what we call depth ore is just that advanced stage of the faceting process. It results in a weak layer in the snowpack that has lots of space in between those grains, little or no bonding in between those grains, and makes for a very persistent weak layer. When we first started getting those large snowstorms in mid-January this year, our danger went up to considerable as a result of new snow, a little bit of wind loading, and this depth ore layer. Our danger has not dropped from considerable on some aspect or some elevation since the middle of January this year. So it's been a real persistent problem, and it's not likely to go away very soon. Couple of ideas that I was thinking might help you guys deal with this depth ore problem. I see a lot of folks in the backcountry who find one particular snowpack test that they like. Maybe they like the compression test, maybe they like an extended column. If you go out and take a level 2 course, there's loads and loads of snowpack tests to choose from, and you got to use the right test for the right problem in the snowpack. Thinking about terrain choices a little bit tonight for this deep, persistent, weak layer problem, and then a couple of thoughts about the spring season. I don't know exactly how the weather will play out, but I have an idea what the snowpack is going to do for this year. You guys have probably seen the compression tests. 30 square centimeters dug in the snowpack. You start tapping on that column, series of 30 taps to see what kind of results we get in that snowpack. So the compression test is a small column, and it's completely isolated on 4 sides. Good for finding weak layers, and it's good for determining that fracture character or shear quality that we worry about so much in these tests. The thing that does not work for compression test, deep layers or weak layers that are deeper than 1 meter, 3 feet down in the snowpack. If you have a weak layer at the bottom of the snowpack, and as we start to get in the latter part of the winter, we're going to see that depth ore layer get buried deeper and deeper and deeper. Your tapping on top of that compression test column is not going to affect a weak layer that's more than 3 feet down in that snowpack. So this test is fairly worthless for really deep weak layers. It's also not very good for weak layers that are protected by, let's say, a hard slab. If you've got a really hard wind slab in the snowpack, maybe it's within a meter of the top of the snowpack, but if it's stiff enough, if it's hard enough, when you're tapping on it, you're not going to affect that weak layer underneath it. So deep weak layers and protected weak layers don't work on the compression test. Good alternative, if you like the compression test, you want to keep doing it, try the deep tap test. It is exactly the same, 30 square centimeters for the dimensions, and we do the same series of 30 taps on that test. In order to do this deep tap test, you have to be able to target a specific weak layer in that snowpack. So if you want to know what's going on with that depth hoar layer, it's buried 5 feet down. I'll cut my column to the same size, and I'm going to remove all the snow from 15 centimeters above that weak layer and just get rid of it. So you're tapping specifically on the slab and the weak layer below it. And that works pretty well, and it kind of eliminates some of those problems that we see with the compression test, where it just doesn't work with deep weak layers. So if you haven't heard of this one, it has been around for a few years. Good idea. You'll see it in a level 2 course. And if you guys don't have a copy of the SWAG, Snow, Weather, and Avalanche Guidelines, you can get it through American Avalanche Association. And that's got written descriptions of all of these tests and how to perform them. From the video earlier, you guys saw a lot of us doing that extended column test. Really good newer test. Gives us fracture initiation and propagation across that column. Again, it has the same limitations as the compression test does. It doesn't work for deep weak layers, and it doesn't work for protected weak layers that are sitting below a hard slab. Got those. Okay, alternative to the extended column test is the propagation saw test. This one you guys saw in the video a couple times as well. You start on the bottom of a column that's actually on the sidewall of your pit. Identify and target a specific weak layer, and you take the back of your saw and actually cut through that weak layer in that test. And so it's a newer test. It's only been done for maybe the last 5-6 years. There's not a whole lot of data behind it, but we've seen some decent results when you're looking for specific weak layers and figuring out if they can actually propagate, cause a failure across a slope. Works pretty well. And you can do it for any depth of the weak layer. So the standard dimensions on the propagation saw test, like I said, I'll do it on the sidewall of my pit rather than on the front wall. If that weak layer is within a meter of the snow surface, you make your column a meter down the sidewall, and it's 30 centimeters deep. If your weak layer is deeper than that, then you match the column length to the depth of that weak layer. And that's been working fairly well for us. So again, if we're dealing with a deep weak layer, a deep slab problem this winter, start playing with this propagation saw test. Works pretty well. Again, that's in the SWAG book. It's in a level 2 course. In the last few years, we've started teaching those. All right. And for terrain, so certainly some of this is definitely my own opinion from observations of accidents throughout the season here. But the northerly aspects, basically everything from west around to north, around to east, has this depth hoar layer. Pretty much everywhere in the state and just about everywhere in the western U.S. has got this same depth hoar problem. And if you were to pick a specific slope or aspect where you're going to find it, most likely it's going to be that northern half of the compass, slopes facing that direction. Looking at the snowpack that we have, the layering and the difference in hardness between that mid-pack and that lower snowpack weak layer, big steep terrain facing the northerly aspects is probably never really going to be all that safe this year. You might get to a point where that depth hoar layer is buried down far enough that it's going to be hard to trigger. You might be able to travel on those slopes, but if you find a shallow spot in that snowpack or you find a spot that's exceptionally weak, you still might be able to trigger these deep weak layers. So in that sense, I say that some of this terrain will never be safe throughout this season. And I think that's been tough for some folks to accept. With some of the accidents that we've seen people just itching to get out into this steeper terrain. It's like, well, it hasn't snowed in a couple weeks. Yeah, but that weak layer hasn't gotten any better. Kind of along the same lines, like I was mentioning, as that layer gets deeper and deeper in the snowpack, old tracks, even a number of old tracks, don't necessarily mean that you're dealing with a safe slope to travel on. It might just mean that that person hasn't found that shallow or weak spot in the snowpack where they can trigger those avalanches from. So, and then certainly, if you haven't been in the valley long, if you haven't lived in Colorado very long and dealt with a depth tour snowpack like we have this year, terrain that you rode last year, terrain that you rode the year before is probably not going to be safe to go into this year. We may not get to a point where it is safe. Okay. Because of the size of those depth tour grains, because of all the pore space, the airspace in between those grains, they're not going to change. And we're kind of stuck with 6, 7, 8 millimeter depth tour grains for the rest of the season. They're not going to get a whole lot better. And I've had a couple of conversations with my boss, with some friends. We've heard this question a lot this winter. It's like, okay, what's it going to take for this snowpack to improve? There's really nothing you can do other than wait for it to melt in August. Another important thing to think about as we start transitioning into the spring season. We're in late February right now. Sometime soon we're going to get that first big warm-up where temperatures are going to spike. We're going to get some strong radiation. When that depth tour layer gets wet for the first couple of times, there's going to be some large full-depth avalanches for sure. So something to think about as we start getting into the warm season. That layer is going to be scary well into the spring this year, and it will probably keep producing avalanches even late into the season. Okay, that I mentioned. It'll be safe in August. Sorry. That said, now that I've scared you for a half hour, there is some really good turns out there if you're content skiing under 30 degrees. There are places in the state that have a slightly deeper, stronger snowpack. The southern areas of the San Juan Range are near or above average for snowpack. It's about the only place in the west where you've got a deeper, stronger snowpack. So there are places around the state where that snowpack's a little bit deeper, a little bit safer. The sunny aspects, those south and southwest facing slopes, they were bare all the way into early January this year, so they don't have that depth tour layer. They still do have weak layers. There's crusts, there's facets on those southerly aspects, but I've also had times where there's really good stability on southwest facing slopes, and I've been able to get out into a little bit steeper terrain. So it's not all hopeless. And actually, this midwinter time frame that we're in, if you catch it after a snowstorm, sometimes you can actually still find some good powder skiing. And then, of course, there's the western slope. Hiking, biking, trail running, everything's been good all winter down there. So, something good to think about, huh? And I'll take any questions if we have them.
I've got a question.
Yes.
Has anybody ever considered, with the compression test, you do the deep tap test cutting off the top layers of the snowpack. Has anybody ever considered or tried doing this deep tap with an ECT?
I have played with it myself, yeah. At the moment, there's not, it's not really a standardized test, but I would imagine you could see some good results out of a deep test there too as well, yeah.
Okay.
Certainly, it's something I've done where maybe I've had a result on the upper portion of the column and I'll clean it up to target another specific weak layer. Yeah, not a formal test, but good idea. All right, we'll make a quick transition to, actually I got one more question here, Mike.
Is any warming this weekend? I understand there's some. Is that going to be significant enough, do you think, that's going to have any effect on that deeper instability?
No, at this point it's not. I dug a couple of pits 2 days ago on some southwest facing slopes, and it still looks like a winter snowpack. There's some thin crusts from some warm weather just prior to last weekend storms, but in general it's a winter snowpack, and it'll take maybe a little bit longer days and some really mild temperatures to get water to start flowing down deeper into that snowpack. We're not quite there yet. So it's coming though, March. All right, thanks.
Thanks, Brian. That's great. Okay, we've got a couple DVDs to show you here. Teaser. Make sure. You've got your thing. Just play it.
Yeah, we'll check out a couple of these. Are just some trailers from a couple of films that I've worked on, and kind of get us out of the driver's ed mode, and then we'll start talking about decisions and some stuff that I've studied over the past couple years that could potentially help you guys.
It's Mount Everest. It's adventurer's peak. It's everything you hear about it. It just draws you to it. We had no clue about other people that were doing high altitude skiing. Skiing Everest had been a dream for us for a long, long time. 1 in 35 people die trying to climb in the 8,000 meter arena. A lot of people do ask, why do you do it?
If you make a mistake and you fall, you're dead. Mountains don't care who you are.
Trying to ski at that altitude is absolutely insane. Every single turn was a ridiculous struggle.
Altitude can sneak up on you and it can just slam you. It doesn't matter how strong you are, how experienced you are. It's unbelievably draining. It's an altitude game, and it's a mental game. It's survival skiing. Gotta push yourself into that discomfort zone.
We're 25, 26 out.
We didn't even really think of bringing oxygen.
About 7,700 meters.
It's not a matter of getting to the top, it's a matter of getting as far as your body's gonna let you, and you know that that's your summit. Jimmy is the big brother figure on these trips, the calm voice of reason.
Hey!
John's an Olympian and a tremendous athlete.
It's a bigger day than I thought it was going to be.
Mike motivates everyone, and the fact that he gets the footage that he gets, he's passionate about it. Steve has graduated into being the leader on the trips, the person that everyone agrees has the final say. When you're out there on those peaks, the camaraderie of being part of a team is like nothing else in the world. I was scared out of my mind. I stopped and thought to myself, this is not where I want to die.
We heard this huge crack. At that moment, I just thought, so this is how it all ends. Mike looks at me and he says, what do we do? And I said, run.
Climbing without skiing is just pain and suffering with lousy food at the end of the day, as far as I'm concerned. Climbers have short memories, and the stuff that you don't like, you forget real quick, and the stuff that you do like, you hang on forever. After we got back from our last trip to Choyo-Yu on Everest, we were tired from Himalayan climbing. I mean, it's just massive crowds and fixed lines, and it just really doesn't give you a flavor for what actual ski mountaineering is all about. And we needed to go back to some places, and we needed to find ourselves. There's a whole world of adventure out there. I mean, there are places and mountains, things to be skied that most climbers, let alone skiers, have never heard of. And the beauty of going back to these places is they force you to use every skill set that you've ever had just in order to survive. It's incredible.
We're gonna go touch it today. Screw a picket. I don't think we'll need them, but we got them. We got a rope. We're gonna go down this dirt ridge, gonna get on the snow, and we're gonna find a way up over the top of that snow dome right there.
It was funny, man, because that was great coming up that ramp there. We got to here, I figured, oh, maybe half an hour. And that must have been, what, an hour?
Feeling good, overslept, but we'll make up for it. How you doing?
I'm good, but that's definitely the hardest thing I've ever done. Times. That was a hard 10.
Kip Joe, how you doing?
Oftentimes when you venture into these no-name peaks, you'll experience one of those rare moments in life when reality actually exceeds even your dreams. You also come to a really clear understanding that when you're in this game long enough, oftentimes you have to move backwards in order to move beyond where you've been.
Yeah, that's it. Okay, well, thanks to the organization for inviting me to come and talk. And what I wanted to talk to you guys about, I've been in the valley my whole life, and I started skiing in the backcountry around here when I was about 12 years old. And I've gradually, over the last 2.5, 3 decades, have taken it all around the world and have been exposed to a lot of different scenarios on expeditions to about 40 or 50 of these big 6, 7, and 8,000 meter peaks. And about 2 years ago, I was reading in the papers and just following some of the accidents. And one of the things that struck me, and I don't have it quantified or anything, but I remember thinking that in about a 4-year period in this valley alone, more people had been killed in the backcountry and avalanches and falling off cliffs and so forth than I could remember in about the last 40 years. And so I started to look at some of these accidents and then I also, and I really recommend it to everybody, get the accidents to North American Mountaineering from the American Alpine Club and read books, because when you go to the bookstore and you're reading about climbing, you're going to be reading about epics. And reading about epics is a great way to live vicariously through other people's mistakes. And it's really important to understand that oftentimes we refer to these things as accidents. And when you learn how the brain functions, they're actually more on the side of mistakes than they are accidents often. The other thing that I found when I started to look at these accidents is that oftentimes, and especially in North American mountaineering, a lot of these climbers that were going out and getting hurt were very experienced, and they had a lot of knowledge base and a lot of years behind them, and it was actually a fairly rare occurrence when somebody just got in over their head and got hurt. And then on top of it, around here locally, we had incidents over the past few years where guides actually ran into trouble with clients and with friends, and I knew some of these people, and I just thought, you know, these guys are so qualified and they're so good that there has to be a common denominator as to how smart people can go out and get into trouble. And I came across a pretty famous writer on the subject, a guy named Lawrence Gonzalez, who actually started out one of his books with the phrase, "Why intelligent people do really stupid things." And I started to read through the process of people making mistakes, not just in skiing and in mountaineering, but in life. And he set off to really study the subject. So I mean, I'm by no means an expert. I've just gone out and I've just self-educated myself on this stuff, and I've come up with a few tidbits that I think can really help people, and things that can that I know that I've applied to my climbing that are concrete evidence of how you can back yourself off of a situation in order to see the big picture and why that's so important. And so to start out, you literally have to go back to when human beings first developed. And you have to go back to literally when we were cavemen. And the reason you have to do that is because back then, that's when the brain really started to form and to evolve. And back when cavemen were around, we were almost exclusively emotional beasts. And it was only over time that the intelligent vortex of the brain started to develop. But back then, if the saber-toothed tiger was chasing you, you had two options. You could either fight or flight. You could run or you could fight the thing. And what happened in the process of being successful from running from that tiger is all of the things that happen in our brains right now. The endorphins start to flow, and the dopamine starts to flow, and success breeds mental models, which then develop behavior models, and it feels good to survive. It felt good back then, and it feels good right now. But the problem that we have with the evolution of the brain is that this emotional vortex started to develop so much earlier that even today we are still extremely emotional, some people more than others. But we're very emotional, and intelligence almost always gets trumped by the emotional vortex. So when you've got, in the case of the people in this room right now, when you've got people that have been out and they've had success and they've skied powder and they have that mental image, or for me, when I'm out on these peaks and I see the vistas and I get to the top or whatever and then I ski down, that forms an unbelievably strong mental model. And those mental models then drive behavior. And you have to understand that over evolution, the brain and mental models were created to capture general subjects. For example, when you teach your child how to tie his shoe, he is never going to forget how to tie his shoe. And he will use that mental model for the rest of his life whenever he's tying a knot. And he will learn how to tie an apron. He will learn how to tie a clothesline. He'll learn how to tie all sorts of knots. In my case, I always relate it back to 8th grade outdoor ed. And I had a person who was teaching us about climbing, and I remember on the first day, I had never climbed in 8th grade, and he said, okay, here's the rope. You guys are going to be as high as this gymnasium, and you're going to be hanging from that rope. I want you to tie into that rope, and I want you to make sure that it's tied well enough to where you're not going to fall. So I immediately started tying overhand knots and overhand knots and this knot and that knot, and I yanked on it, and I had my buddies yank on it. And he came up to me and he said, is that knot going to hold you? And I said, yeah, that's going to hold me. And he started to wiggle the rope like this, and the thing just fell off. And he said, okay, I don't think that knot is going to hold you. Let me teach you how to do it a different way. And he taught me how to tie a bowline with one hand. And to this day, you know, behind the tree and through the whole method of tying it. I couldn't teach anybody in here how to tie a bowline knot, but if you gave me a rope, I could tie into it with one hand like nobody's business. And where I'm going with this is that you take that one mental model from when I learned how to tie my shoe, and you take in 8th grade this man teaching me how to tie that bowline. That has stuck with me as a mental model. So these mental models are extremely powerful, and then when I graduate into using a harness and tying all the other knots that I have to tie in climbing, the mental model is there from that experience to teach me that, okay, this is very important, because if I don't learn how to tie this knot, the ramifications could be drastic. So that's an idea of how mental models work. And mental models work the same way with us when we're out skiing. So if you take the person who has spent their life skiing in the backcountry and they've had success, and you put them on top of a slope, and even if they go through the process of doing the pit analysis and doing everything they learned in their avalanche classes, if that powder slope is beautiful enough, and if the sky is pretty, and if their friends are encouraging them, there's almost no way, if they don't understand how the brain works, there's almost no way for them to make a decision based on intelligence, based on this pit, that they shouldn't ski that slope. And for example, when we look at the accident that happened in Highlands, I don't need to debate that accident at all, but I remember reading in the paper that there was one line that just stuck out in this analysis that I learned from reading from Lawrence Gonzalez, and it was one line: we did everything by the book. We skied the slope that morning and we were having the time of our lives. Well, that right there in and of itself was a message that they had the quote unquote the time of their lives. That's an incredibly emotional response. And if you don't understand how to isolate yourself from a situation and to engage intelligence and to look at all of the specifics that go into making decision making, emotions always override intelligence. About 15 years ago, I was up skiing in Alaska, and I was with my twin brother Steve, and the pilot would drop us off in the morning and we would go up and we would climb and ski. And we had arrived after 30 days of virtually perfect conditions. And then we went out and we skied every day for a week. And on the last day, the pilot decided that he wanted to go with us. Now you got to understand that this pilot, it was his backyard. He was a phenomenal climber. He was an incredibly experienced skier, and he was our pilot, and he was just old enough to where we absolutely idolized him. So we fly up to the base of this peak, and we immediately jump out of the airplane, and it had gotten really warm that night, and the first words out of Steve's mouth were, "The snow has changed. This is dangerous. I'm not going." And this pilot who had flown us up there, who had not been skiing for 3 or 4 weeks because he was flying all these people around, he said, "It's safe. This is my backyard. I know what I'm doing. I'm going for it." And Steve and I immediately had an emotional response. We idolized this guy. We just said, I mean, I can literally remember thinking, it's his backyard. I'm going to defer with him. And we went out with him. And it gets worse, because as we climbed up this slope, it was a peak that looked about like Daly, except it was a 6,000-foot face. And as we started to climb up it, we're looking at this slope next to us is bluebird sky. I mean, the powder is amazing. It's right at 30 degrees, and it just looks beautiful. And I can remember after the fact thinking that this is just going to be so amazing. And the thought of getting out of that airplane and making a decision, just an instant decision based on obvious facts and intelligence, completely vanished. So we got up this peak, and the pilot jumped in and he skied down. And I can honestly say that I was not thinking even remotely of an avalanche. And I jumped into this thing and I made about a dozen turns, and all of a sudden I got sick to my stomach. I fell backwards, and I looked behind me, and the whole slope is cracked and it's going. And the next thing I noticed in front of me, there was a wall of snow 15 or 20 feet high. And I remember thinking, that looks identical to a wave in the ocean. And I didn't panic, but I skied to the side, and my first initial reaction was, what am I doing? I mean, I can't believe that I skied that slope, and I reverted back to the intelligence. that I had when I got into the airplane. And then I made sure that he was okay. Then we skied back to the plane, and it was an event where I had an emotional reaction that formed a mental model that was based on a mental model of emotion that had turned into a near disaster, which created a mental model that to this day changes the way that I ride a bike. It changed the way that I drive a car. It changed the way that I cross the street. It changed the way that I do everything, because I realized for the first time in my life that disasters, not only can they happen, but it just did. And that formed a mental model almost to my detriment, because now when I'm in the backcountry, you can see from these videos, if it's not hard snow, I rarely ski powder slopes in the backcountry. And even when I'm skiing on something like the Highlands Bowl on a powder day, I am constantly looking behind me. So mental models can be formed from disastrous situations, but if you go through the process of understanding how the brain works, and if you read these books and you educate yourself, you can actually learn a skill set that can potentially prevent a disaster. So let's move the clock up to another example. About 7 months ago, I was in Bolivia climbing with my brother and some friends, and we had just skied a 20,000 foot peak, and it was just beautiful conditions and blue sky, and so we were going for the next peak, and it was a 22,000 foot peak, and it was a 6,000 foot climb, and we knew that it was going to take every bit of our skill set and our endurance to accomplish it. So the first big hurdle was we knew we had to find the route, and the route was not marked. So we did the best that we could to try and find it in the daylight, knowing that we were going to have to climb it at night. Well, we got up at midnight and we started climbing up this ridge, and we got lost. We couldn't find the route, and by the time we got to the mid-mountain where the snow and ice materialized for us to ski, we were probably 3 or 4 hours off of our scheduled time. But we got up to this midway point, and we're looking at this face, and it's this beautiful snow ridge, and to make matters worse, we thought we were the only people on the mountain. We see this lone climber on the summit ridge. And we immediately rip our packs off, we get the harnesses out, and we start tying into the rope. And I had this yellow pad in my pocket, and it was based on reading this book and Lawrence Gonzalez saying, you've got to figure out a way to get yourself to engage your intelligence. And the book was very simple. It was just one of those little notebooks, and on the cover it said, think. And on the next page, it had ideal scenario of where we should be, what should be happening, what the conditions should be like, so that I could just reference it. And every time I stopped to get a drink of water, I'd pull that thing out. And I didn't even pull it out when I got up there. I was so excited to get climbing. But I ultimately realized I had it. I pulled it out, and it said, think. And I didn't even have to flip the page. And I immediately stepped back from the situation. And I looked at my watch, and I said, okay, it's 1 o'clock. We've probably got 4 hours to the top. That means we're going to be back here. Well, it'll still be daylight by the time we get back here. But to climb up this buttress had a few places that were incredibly exposed, incredibly rotten rock, just impossible to protect, and just an accident waiting to happen. And I looked at the guys and I said, wait a minute, guys. We've got some lenticulars up here. I know there's no storms in the area, but we do have lenticulars. That's a sign of storms. And I said, plus we're 4 hours off of our time. I said, do you guys really want to descend that in the dark? Because if we go for the summit now, we're going to be descending that thing in the dark. And the sadness just crossed their faces, and they dropped their arms, and they just looked at the reality. And when I pointed out the facts, it was a no-brainer. I mean, nobody wanted to descend that in the dark. We would have been incredibly tired because it was a 6,000 foot push up and then back down to get to camp. We didn't have any bivy gear or anything like that, and so we knew we had to turn around. And it was just an example of how understanding this emotional vortex versus this intelligence vortex, and having to step back and literally engage yourself and force yourself to think. It's just too easy to let the excitement of the situation pull you into doing something that you probably don't want to do. So it's important to come to seminars like this and listen to Brian and to get the facts and to educate yourself. But if you don't engage that intelligence, and you just, when you look at the experience level of people that are making these mistakes, these are people that come to these seminars. These are people that are well-read. These are people that have years and years of experience, and they're still making these mistakes. And by and large, this is the reason that they're making the mistakes, because they just fail through the excitement of the day to engage their intelligence and to actually look, am I really doing everything by the book? Am I doing everything by the book, and what is the situation, and do I go or don't I go? The other thing you have to understand as it relates to backcountry skiing, and Brian started to talk to it, and I go round and round about all the gear that we have right now, the packs and the beacons, and I would never in a million years suggest that people shouldn't use that stuff. But I remember I was sitting up in Alaska one time, and we were heading out to climb a big peak, and there was a really famous, very experienced mountaineer named Rudy Omberger. He's a Swiss guy, and he had skied most of all of the great peaks in Europe, and he had skied most of the 5,000-meter peaks in Alaska and Canada, and a lot of the big peaks in the Himalaya. And we were packing our packs, and we put our probes in, and we were putting our shovel in, and he grabbed my shovel. He was a very soft-spoken guy, and he looked at me and he said, you know something? That probe and that shovel have killed more people than they've saved. And he was trying to make a point that when you're dealing with the emotional vortex and the intelligence vortex, yeah, you got to take your shovel, and yeah, you got to take your probe, but whenever you give yourself any advantage against Mother Nature, and whenever you give yourself any kind of perceived benefit that you can potentially survive an avalanche, that has drastic emotional impact on your brain. And regardless of what anybody says, that will come into play. If it didn't come into play, you wouldn't buy the stuff. And so my advice is to buy the stuff, learn how to use it, take the avalanche classes, arm yourself with everything possible, and then forget about the gear. Forget about the gear, because all that gear is meant to save you if shit hits the fan. And after the fact. It's not meant to prevent you from going into the backcountry, and it just absolutely encourages. And when you look at in particular in the book, when you look at some of the same types of devices that the military uses to prevent disasters, and when you look at the studies in the military, you can see that across the board that this stuff impacts decisions, and it actually does influence people's decisions, and gets into this scenario where we're not talking about accidents, we're talking about mistakes. And that's really what we're talking about in the backcountry. So it's study everything that you can, arm yourself with everything that you can, but then you got to use it. And you literally have to take the pad out of your pocket, and you have to step back, and you have to look at what you're doing, and you have to analyze everything, and you have to do it a lot. And if you do that, you're not even guaranteed to eliminate that emotional tug, because it's like I said, they've done the studies, and they look at the statistics, and I can't quantify it right here. I haven't studied it that much, but when you do read these accidents, and when you do read about what happened, I mean, it's clear that the emotional tug really influences people, and it leads to, as Lawrence Gonzalez says, really intelligent, experienced people making mistakes. So it was enough for me at age 47, having a family and kids, to try and figure it out, and to find out what this common denominator was. And so I would encourage people to, go read Lawrence. He's one of the predominant guys that writes about it. But there are a lot of people in the survival books, and they all kind of touch on this stuff. And it's a relatively new science, but it's developing, and as it develops, hopefully people will be able to arm themselves with the information that they need to be safe. So if anybody has any questions.
Raise your hand. I've got the microphone. Mike, that was truly interesting, and definitely something to think about.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks.
All right, well, thanks for coming, and be safe out there, have fun, and we'll see you next time. For Powder to the People, I'm Mike Sladden. Good night.